While MIT may be the current ground zero in the dirty money debate, drawing outrage from students, the community, and advocates across the country, the school is far from alone in navigating the rough waters of cash flows. Of course, it came to light earlier this month that the school accepted anonymous donations from Jeffrey Epstein after his 2008 conviction for soliciting an underage girl for prostitution. And the director of the university's renowned media lab, Joey Ito, stepped down after a whistleblower told the New Yorker's Ronan Farrow that, quote, although Epstein was listed as disqualified in MIT's official donor database, the Media Lab continued to accept gifts from him, consulted him about the use of the funds, and by marking his contributions as anonymous, avoided disclosing their full extent. And though Harvard University says it rejected donations from Epstein after his conviction, the university is reviewing any indirect ways his money might have benefited Harvard. All of this has ignited a larger debate about who nonprofit institutions should be taking money from, like the Sackler family, implicated in the opioid crisis, which has led to the death of thousands. But where do you draw the line? Joining me to discuss are Tina Opie. She's an associate professor at Babson College and a visiting associate professor at MIT through the MLK Scholars Program. Good to see you again, Tina.
Thanks.
Phil Buchanan is president of the Center for Effective Philanthropy. It's a nonprofit that offers comparative data to help inform potential funders. Phil, it's good to meet you. Thanks for being here. Let me just get something I assume is obvious out of the way. Is there any argument to be made that MIT's Media Lab should have taken money from Jeffrey Epstein after they became aware of his conviction? Is there any argument?
I don't think so. I think this is a pretty clear-cut case.
Do you think it's a clear-cut case?
Yeah, absolutely.
And the notion that they should donate the money to charity is a pretty easy conclusion to reach to?
At this point, I think so.
And do people up the chain of command who didn't disclose until they were forced to, including the president, that they knew about both the donations and the timing of the donations, do they have to go, or is that an open question?
I don't know if they have to go, but they certainly bear responsibility. It's clear now that they knew, but even if they hadn't known, they should have set in place the sort of practices and values that would lead to questioning that would have led to the gift being turned down, the gifts being turned down in the first place.
I want to talk about those practices,
Right.
the general practices in a minute. One more example, because obviously it's close to home. Harvard, as I said, Larry Bacow in his letter, the president's letter, contends that all of the direct donations preceded 2008. He said the money that's left over, I think it's 180 grand out of 9 million or something, they'll donate to charity. An op-ed in the Globe today said, give it all. Is Harvard doing the right thing, or should they just, they have a fairly large amount of money in their endowment. Should they disgorge all of the money, or is just getting rid of the remaining money okay? Again, this is all allegedly before Epstein's conviction.
I don't know enough of the details about the Harvard case to make that decision, but I do want to piggyback on something that was said earlier. The people who are involved have a responsibility to make a fair accounting of it, and I think that if we find that the full amount was in fact related to this particular instance, then yeah, that should be disgorged. But I want to be careful here, because I am going to venture and say that there are many organizations, not just nonprofits, but organizations that if we were to do some investigation, they've probably accepted funds from things that we might not like publicly.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because Larry Lessig is at Harvard, who's been here, has gotten himself into a little bit of trouble. He says, in the ideal world, you don't take the money from Epstein. By the way, he disclosed he's a friend of Ito's
Right.
and known him for a long time. But much of the money, he says, that props up institutions, like you said a minute ago, comes from, quote, troubling sources. So here's his tweet trying to clarify his position. If, notice that's in capitals. I wish I could change the font size, maybe bold it, but whatever. If that kind of does it, a university takes either kind of money, then at least it should take it anonymously. Why anonymously? Because if, and then all the ifs, at the very least, avoid giving the doers of wrong the chance to launder their reputation.
Yeah,
You're both shaking your heads.
No.
I'm not a fan of anonymity. I mean, I think usually when the instinct is to want to hide something, that tells you it's probably the wrong thing to do. And also, I think particularly for universities, the public has a legitimate interest in knowing who's funding that institution, who's funding the research that it's doing. Now, I know anonymous gifts are a long-standing practice in philanthropy, but I'm not a huge fan.
But not to cover up evildoers, theoretically,
Right.
which is
I
what
mean,
was
that's
intended
exactly
in this
right.
case.
Yeah,
Exactly right.
it's very different if someone is being anonymous because they are being humble versus they're trying to cover up a
Let me give
bad
you one more
behavior.
example before we get to your general rules of the road. How about you don't have a $40 billion indictment? You're a struggling nonprofit institution. A questionable source offers you money, you say, I'm going to disclose the source and I'm going to do wonderful things with it. Many years ago, I ran a tax reform group. The guy who now runs the U.S. Chamber of Commerce was head of the Tobacco Institute. I was fighting in that job a cigarette tax because it was inequitable. He was fighting it because it was a cigarette tax. He offered me a blank check in my office, fill it out, and he said at the end, I don't want you to do one thing differently than you're doing now. Do the work you would have done otherwise. Disclose that we gave you the money. Was I wrong to turn it down?
No, I don't think so, but it's complicated, and I'm glad you're bringing the focus back to the vast majority of nonprofits, right? Typical nonprofit has a few staff, under $1 million budget, no endowment, not even much of a reserve fund for a rainy day. And so these are really difficult choices, and I think you have to ask yourself, would I be embarrassed if people knew we were taking this funding?
In which case, don't take it.
I think in general, right?
Okay.
Is this funding running contrary to our organizational mission or values? Is there something expected in return beyond what I'm comfortable giving? Those are some questions, and there aren't easy answers. And you can think of folks who are literally having to make a choice about, do I accept this money and potentially not help people in desperate need?
Yeah.
There's no easy answers here.
Well, I want to make it a little bit clear in my case. And again, I'm not running a nonprofit. And again, I want to broaden this to organizations as well. I think a simple rule, if some people at MIT, because we've been talking about this, have said, listen, if the person who is giving the money has been involved in, I don't know, pedophilia,
right,
or white supremacy or sexual assault, don't take the money from them. Now that sounds pretty naive to some people because they're saying, wait, we could do so much good with that money. However, where do you stand? What do you stand for? What are the values of organizations?
So you enumerated 3 horrible crimes.
Yep.
Where is the line? What's the crime where if you atone for your crime and you apologize? Michael Milken just had the George Washington University School of Public Health. He engaged in illegal securities stuff, 10 years in jail, only served 22 months, comes out, spends a lot of money working on curing serious diseases. George Washington just named, he gave $80 million, their School of Public Health against Michael Milken. He didn't sexually assault anybody. He committed pretty serious felonies, crimes.
Intentionally,
and apparently it atoned as best he could. If you atone, is your money become clean enough to take?
We talked about this before on the show. Restorative justice, I do think, is a real thing. And if this person has atoned in public, as well as to the victims or to the people that they perpetrated the crimes against, that's a different discussion.
So a sexual assaulter who atones and apologizes to the men or women who they have wronged,
after they go to jail,
after they go,
then you need to go to jail. You need to go to therapy. I mean, we don't want to get into discussions of recidivism and whether or not you can actually fully atone for that. But if there is someone who has a truly repentant heart, who has done their time,
paid their debt in many ways,
went to the victims, asked the victims how they'd like to be repaid, and done that, that's a different process.
Are you comfortable with that?
Yeah, I think I agree, and I also think a really important distinction is money that was made 20 years ago, and I can't do anything as a nonprofit about what was done in the past, but now it sits in a foundation. I want to raise money from that foundation, versus a donor who comes to me, and I think they're using me, in the case, arguably, of the Sacklers, for instance, to distract from a evil deed that they are continuing to do, then I think you want to say, no, I don't want to be a part of that. I don't want to be complicit in this. I'm not going to take that
But what
money.
do you say when you're Harvard in response to you, and they haven't authorized me to speak for them, but I know what they have said is, I think it was Arthur Sackler, whoever it was who gave the money that caused us to name the building after him.
Right.
This was given years before OxyContin was even...
right. You can't be accountable for what you can't possibly know. But
it does hurt people who are victims, people today who are victims of Purdue Pharma's behavior with OxyContin want that name taken down despite that fact.
Understandably. And I think that every development officer, every nonprofit, every university needs to be having serious conversation now about issues like this. How do we make sure we preserve the right to rename a building in the case of A, B, or C?
I also think it's important. So I don't necessarily fully agree with the comment that you can't be held responsible for what happened 2 decades ago, especially if that behavior continues in the present. And I know that's not exactly what you're saying. I just want to add that nuance in there. But We do have technology where you can trace that back, right? So if in the present time, we know that they're engaging in behavior, and 20 years ago they were doing the same thing, why, or they stopped then. Why did they stop? Was it because they repented, they had some kind of come to Jesus moment and they decided to do differently, or was it because they were trying to hide and obfuscate the past? I think that's also important to know, and I do think it's incumbent upon development officers to do that kind of digging and find out.
But he would say if they're trying to
where the money
obfuscate
came
the
from.
past, just say no. Am I not right?
Yeah, that's right.
Good.
And the distinction I was trying to draw, I think one of the problems, we talk about philanthropy, and we tend to
Broad
not
brush.
differentiate. It's
Yeah.
a very broad brush. And so what I had in mind is more like the Ford Foundation, which exists today, doesn't actually have any connection to the original donor. So my taking a principled stand against the original donor's anti-Semitism or racism isn't really doing a lot of good, right? This is now an institution with its own identity, actually funds very progressive, causes. So we need to, and that's obvious on one level. And on the other hand, there's a tendency to generalize about philanthropy in a way that sort of obscures these distinctions.
To be continued. Pleasure to meet you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much
Thanks
for your
for having
thoughts,
me.
Tina. Great to
Thanks,
see you,
Joe.
as always.